I think we can start at least a minute earlier. So, Your Excellencies, dear Belgrade Security Forum organizers, dear guests, dear speakers, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming to the panel titled Winter of Discontent in the MENA region. My name is Tijana Rečević. I'm a junior researcher and a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political Science here in Belgrade, and I got the honor to moderate this exciting panel with 4 extraordinary speakers. Having started my undergrad studies in international relations back in 2010, I had an impression that almost no lecture in the following years had passed, at least without mentioning, if not thoroughly analyzing, the developments in the Arab Spring. At first, the overall tone was super optimistic, abundant of talks on people's uprising, popular will, demand for freedom, demand for democracy, sense of possibility not only for the regime change, but also for rewriting the entire social contracts between the political elites and people in the MENA region. Nevertheless, once these things did not proceed in a linear or stable manner as expected by the optimists, extreme pessimism took the stage. And MENA region became somewhat a critical study for all kinds of failure questions. While popular revolutions fail, while external state building fails, while liberal peace building fails, why democracy outside of us fails, and why authoritarianism prevails in the East. Perhaps the only competing region in this regard was the Western Balkans region, often also talked about in a similar manner of a conflict trap which captures the people in the vicious circles of underdevelopment and war. Today, we hear that the situation is not much different. We hear that democracy is rare in the region, that autocracy is common, use of repression in domestic political affairs quite endemic, and we hear that the very same problems which draw people to the streets during the Arab Spring are still making them protest on the streets of Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon this winter as well. So it seems that taking a middle position and moderate prognosis is somewhat a tough job even today. But this is exactly what we will try to do today. We'll try to talk about, at least in a cautiously optimistic manner, about the future of the region and tackle its challenges and problems, but also some untapped potential for steering the development of the MENA region. I have 4 distinguished panelists with quite a different background, which I assume can only contribute to the quality of discussion. On my right is Dr. Hilary Kalmbach, who is a cultural and social historian from the University of Sussex and also founding director of the Middle East and North Africa Center at Sussex. Her research addresses culture, art, and religion in the Arab-speaking countries of the Middle East, focusing on the issues of authority, knowledge, education, and gender. On her right is Mr. Mohammed Anwar al-Sadat, who is the president of the Reform and Development Party in Egypt, an active member of the Egyptian Council of Foreign Affairs, as well as a founder and chairman of Al-Sadat Association for Social Development. Mr. al-Sadat served as in parliament in 2012, when he was the chairman of the Human Rights Committee and a member of the Constituent Assembly of the Constitution. He was again elected to the Egyptian parliament in 2015, but then left the parliament in March 2017. His right is Mr. Tobias Schneider, who is a research fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and also an editor of a weekly subscription service, Syrian Context. His work focuses on the political economy of conflict and mass violence in the contemporary Middle East and related issues of state weakness, insurgency, counterinsurgency, and security sector development. Mr. Yusuf Sherif is the head of the Columbia Global Center in Tunis and a member of the Carnegie Civic Research Network. He was previously affiliated with the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, as well as with the Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies. So having in mind the rather different and rich biographies of our panelists, I'll try to take as little time as possible and leave the panel to the experts. And I'll probably start with some broad questions, and which will then steer the discussion in a more focused manner. I would then, after the first hour, the panel will be given the floor and the word will be given to you, as I am sure that the panelists will steer some thought-provoking questions and comments. In the meantime, I would also like to encourage you on social media to use the official hashtag of the Belgrade Security Forum and transform this and transfer also this hopefully vibrant discussion to the online platforms. So I would first like to ask the speakers to use the first couple of minutes. It would be ideal if you use the 4 minutes, because this is per the instructions of the organizers. Then just give us some opening remarks on your thoughts and some long-term, perhaps, trends and overall impressions on the development of the MENA region and perhaps the legacy of the Arab Springs we talked about. So maybe we can proceed in this way and with Dr. Kalmbach starting first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As our this very generous introduction indicated, I'm a cultural historian. It's perhaps a slightly unusual background to have at a forum like this, but I think that actually both culture and history reveal certain aspects that are important but overlooked. So the first aspect that I want to highlight is, especially given that there may be people in the region who are not familiar with it particularly, I want to highlight the importance of historical memories and narratives in shaping how people perceive the world around them. And obviously that's true everywhere, but it can be especially true in certain circumstances in the Middle East. So histories related to European colonialism and imperialism are especially important, but in specific situations, older historical references, for instance, to Ottoman rule, to the Crusades, to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they can be relevant too. And as a result, agendas promoting democratization, development, gender equality, things like this, can be perceived as the latest chapter in a history of high-handed Western intervention, or as the latest example of Western double standards. And so, for instance, this double standard would be the idea that the powerful countries of Europe and North America have one standard for themselves with respect to democracy, freedom, and sovereignty, and another standard for potential colonies, clients, or strategic allies. Therefore, to become involved in the region, it's essential to have a thorough understanding of the historical and cultural context and to consider carefully how that context is likely to impact the initiative. It could help to think about the need to translate between cultures and societies as carefully as we think about how to translate between languages. This dynamic also means, potentially positively for many people in the room, this dynamic does also mean that representatives or initiatives that are associated with European countries without significant colonial imperial legacies in the region might find it easier to get involved. The second element, so that's the kind of the history bit. The second element that I want to highlight is more related to culture, and it is potentially one way to address contentious histories and bridge cultural differences, and it also is something that I think is often overlooked. It involves a focus on the people of the Middle East and North Africa region themselves. And the point I want to highlight is the importance of emotional needs once basic physical and security needs are met. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. Understandably, many initiatives focus on the bottom two levels, the most important levels of needs. So that's physiological needs and safety. Clearly, those are the most important. But I think it's easy to overlook the upper levels, which are love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. These levels have to do with emotions, with opportunities, with kind of more soft, less quantifiable things. And for people to interact with each other in a secure and collaborative way and really achieve their potential as a member of society, it's really important to feel included, understood, listened to, respected, valued, to feel that there are opportunities, that there's a connection between effort and reward most of the time. You know, to have a kind of we're all in it together sort of spirit within a society or community. And also to feel that there are enough resources to go around, that improvements in the well-being of others, whether it's somebody of a different gender, a different religion, a different generation, or from a different country originally, that improvements in groups that are different in those ways from you isn't coming at your expense. That is, that it's not a zero-sum game, that other people's standing and status can improve without yours declining. And finally, for people to feel content, happy, or satisfied with their position in life, the gap between expectations and reality needs to go in the right direction. That is, their reality needs to be better than what they expected it to be. And of course, that's quite challenging in a period of economic decline and social media exaggeration of just how well people are doing. So what does all of this mean? And of course, many of these things these observations would be very useful in European and North American contexts as well as in the Middle East. But what does it mean in the Middle East? Many states in the Middle East and North Africa focus primarily on providing their citizens with safety and physical well-being, but they don't necessarily address as thoroughly these other emotional needs related to emotional and opportunities, emotions and opportunities. And democratization in and of itself will not necessarily meet these needs either. And this is shown in particular by the rising populism, rising polarity, kind of us versus them mentalities that we see in Europe, in the US, and in the UK. So as a result, leadership is crucial. Avoiding the easy path, so governing through consent instead of coercion, not telling people what they want to hear, but taking the time to listen to the concerns of dissenting groups, to be open and transparent about what is and isn't possible to address those concerns, and to find a way to move the group as a whole towards consensus, even if it requires compromising interests important to whoever is the leader. Also important is not only helping those who are at the bottom socioeconomically, so not just raising people at the bottom up, but also decreasing the difference between the bottom and the top, that is decreasing overall inequality across a society. Of course, it's important to address the needs and concerns of the entire population, not only those who are responsible for the leader being in power. And this can include making a commitment to protect minority interests. Finally, facilitating the bridging of differences between groups within society is also quite important to combat this us versus them sort of mentality. So what I'm trying to say here is that meeting demands for democracy is an important first step, but it won't create the sorts of societies, cultures, states that are aspired to if they aren't connected or accompanied by these other things as well. Now, just as a small point related to this, but also related to my own expertise. So I'm a historian who studies, in part, I study the context from which Islamism and political Islam emerged. And one example of an unproductive way to deal with a problem, I think, is that throwing Islamists in prison. Essentially, throwing them in prison will not stop the growth of support for more explicitly Islamic states and societies. It's a path that's already been tried and has failed quite thoroughly. As far as I can see, looking back at history, it's much more likely to facilitate the emergence of more extreme positions like polarization, more radicalization, more division between groups. So to sum up, I want to suggest that how the Middle East and North Africa will react to the challenges of the near future, challenges that include, of course, climate crisis, demographic crisis, economic challenges, that how they respond to these challenges will depend on historical narratives that influence perceptions of present and future, as well as the extent to which states and societies meet the emotional as well as physical needs of their members. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Anwarel Sadat.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm glad that there have been a chance to have a part of this conference speaking about the MENA region, which I believe it's important because we share the same challenges. And honestly, what I have heard yesterday and today speaking about climate change, security, migration, justice, this is all what we are really concerned about in our part of the world. So if we are speaking about a winter of this content, as a matter of fact, we are having a difficult time in Middle East and North Africa nowadays. We have had big hope when this Arab Spring happened in 2011. But, nothing have materialized. There have been setback, and nobody knows actually what could happen even on the coming, let's say, months or coming winter or 2020. But again, what I believe is that the main problem, which have been during the last couple of years, is that people do not feel that they are part of any of, let's say, policies or decisions related to their present or future life. They are completely isolated, marginalized. We have also problems, and this is common in the whole Middle East and North Africa. We don't have real institutions. Yes, we have by name parliaments, we have by name judiciary or justice system, but does it function? Does it really hold whoever, the government, the president, or even the emir? No one, honestly, feel that this, let's say, institutions could hold anyone accountable or responsible. This is what we have been witnessing during the last couple of years. So one of the main problem is that we do have problem when it comes to institutions. The judiciary system, justice, which the slogan of the conference today is about. The legislative body is also very limited. They cannot question, they cannot hold accountability for the government or for anyone. And also the media there is no real free media. And we have been witnessing a lot of crackdown on a lot of activists and also journalists. So, I mean, this is the real problem. So, unless those governments will have to realize that it's time that there has to be inclusiveness, people has to feel that they are part of what is really happening. Otherwise, we will always end up with surprises. Maybe it takes time, but it will come. Nothing lasts forever, you know. We have seen in Egypt as a case, Mubarak was a president for 30 years, but it ended up, as we all have been witnessing, with a revolution, and he was out. So this theory of strongmen, which have been somehow promoted by the Americans or by Europeans, some European countries, it does not last. It does not give sustainability, and this is what we even have been witnessing in Egypt during the last months, that people are fed up and tired, and they want to see a real change happening. They want to see, that all those fundamental rights, which is basic, it's really there. So we will see what will happen. I am not of those I'm always optimistic. I believe that there is always a chance, especially in Egypt case. We always have difficult times, ups and downs, but I think by time, those people have to realize that, especially with the latest economic reforms we have in Egypt, we had a deal with the IMF, but it have had an impact on most of middle class and also ordinary Egyptians, very severe pressure on them, and people are really cannot have a way of a decent life. It's a very difficult time we have now in Egypt. The economic reform was a must, I believe. And when it comes to subsidies with the devaluation of the pound, it was a must. But I mean, it has to be accompanied with some of this social safety nets, some social programs to try to make some balance. So anyway, I mean, it happened. Egyptians are patient. They are willing to wait as long as they can see that there is something really happening or something will be delivered later on. But they cannot wait forever, But I mean, I still believe that the chance is there. As you all know, the MENA region is expected, or it will be in need of more than 20 million jobs has to be created by 2025. And the way I see it, if the business environment is not helping those private businessmen to try to grow and to develop their business, I mean, how can we afford, how can we manage to deal with all these needs? Same as also the direct foreign investment, if they feel that this country is not stable, this country is not safe, or even the just system is not fair, how come they will even think of coming to this country? And also the more of the armed forces, the army, being involved in the, let's say, not only in politics, but also in economy. This is something also has to stop, has to be limited. They cannot expand the way we see it happening, you know. Of course, armed forces in most of the MENA region or North Africa, they do play a big role. Yes, it's true. We have seen this lately also in Sudan, in Algeria. It's happening. The armed forces are highly, let's say, respected by the people, by nature, you know, but they should be limit their, let's say, role on defense, security, but not the way we see it, that they have been very much expanding in economy, competing even with private companies. And, you know, of course, it's not a fair competition simply because they don't pay taxes, they don't pay customs, they don't follow rules, you know. So, I mean, it's not fair. And the problem is that there is no accountability, and no one can dare to question any of these army projects, what they do or how they spend. No one. And there is no monitoring of what they do. And, you know, it's a really a big problem, which we are, I'm sure other countries within the MENA region are also facing. Hopefully, this will change. We will see what will happen in the let's say, coming weeks. We have had messages that we might see some opening up, we might see that the situation will be eased, but so far we haven't seen this. Hopefully that now they got the message after what have been happening during the last couple of weeks, that people are really tired and fed up. But Egyptians, like many others, I'm sure in our part of the world, they need peace, they need stability. People are tired of revolutions and chaos and violence, so people need to have somehow a peaceful life. But also there is fear, because people knows that the regime is tough and they will not tolerate any of this kind of unrest or revolts here or there. So let's be optimistic and see what will happen in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. El-Sadat. Mr. Schneider.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for this really interesting sort of mixed panel with different perspectives. I work on Syria, Lebanon, Iraq for the most part, which again is not a very optimistic part of the world right now. But usually I get to sit on even more pessimistic panels for that. So thank you for having different perspectives together here. I'm not going to talk about Syria right now, even though it's probably the most pertinent conflict in the news. I'm going to start a little smaller and then draw a larger arc and hopefully get to build a little bit on what my fellow co-panelists have already said, and then leave the optimism, hopefully maybe for Yusuf, to come. And starting small, I start with Lebanon, which is a small country with way outsized. I think the historical cliche is always that Lebanon is one of those countries that produces more history than it can consume domestically. It's a small country with outsized problems. And I used to live there, and I do come back quite repeatedly, like 3-4 times a year, let's say. And whenever I did come back over the last half decade or so, I would always greet my Lebanese friends, and they'd ask me, how are you doing? And I'd say, I'm great. And then I'd ask, how are you guys doing? How's Lebanon doing? They say, well, you know, it's the same but worse. It's the same but worse, the same but worse. And they're not wrong. I think especially in the last 2-3 years, whenever you'd come back, you could feel the sort of growing desperation, the sort of growing social attrition, you could almost call it. You could see the decline in everything. The water is poisoned, the air is poisoned, the economies in the the currency is sliding. There is growing desperation, depression. I can tell you of villages, and this is not just for Lebanon, this is obviously true across much of the region, where citizens no longer see the doctors because they think the doctors give them cancer. It's because everybody has cancer in the communities from various forms of pollution. And there's a growing sense of physical deprivation that translates into, I think, what Hillary was very aptly explaining, emotional deprivation and depression. And so as I see these sort of, same but worse, I'm reminded of what my very good friend Emil Hokeim, who's at IISS, always used to say. He said, we always think of ourselves as, speaking as Lebanese, as survivors. We think, here's a conflict that we survived, there's a revolution, there's a power vacuum, here's radicalism, we survived it, and we'll keep persevering, and we have this myth of resilience. But what we don't realize is that the damage is cumulative. It builds up. And this is where on a social scale, where memory comes in, but also just on a very basic sort of economic mismanagement, environmental damage, it builds up. And what it does over time is it fundamentally undermines state-society relations broadly, but both the states and the society's ability to resist external pressure and downturns. It saps resilience out of a society. And for example, in the Syrian context, there was always a lot of talk: is this revolution and this war the consequence of mismanagement and authoritarianism, or is it maybe the direct consequence of mismanagement or authoritarianism, or the indirect consequence of climate change? When we had 3 years of droughts and massive urbanization, and the answer is obviously both. It's a system that cannot cope with external shocks on any level. And what we see right now in the international, on the domestic level, from let's say, a increasingly polarized international system to a sort of stuttering international economy, to increased political polarization, to mismanagement on the ground, is we see, and obviously climate change, we see accelerating and worsening external shocks to systems that can no longer accommodate them, to citizens who can bear no more. And I mean, if we're looking, I think Egypt is a good example. There we have a society that is genuinely, there is not much room for movement. There is not much room for protests, but people are pushed to the point where even with the extraordinary looming threat of the Sisi regime, they're willing to risk their lives and go out in the streets. What we saw in Iraq in the last couple of weeks was extraordinary, not only because this is a society that's gone through unbelievable amounts of violence in the last, you can't even just say decade and a half, frankly, half century. And that despite everything, still youth are out in the streets protesting, not because they have necessarily some optimistic path forward. There is no political party that they can vote for very clearly, but because they're with their backs against the wall. And there's no one left. If you travel in southern Iraq, in Basra, again, the water is poisonous, the air is poisonous, the food's poisonous, and there's no jobs. Whatever jobs there are is from the state, and any future shocks, any drought, any flooding that's happened in the last year can fundament a hot summer that will lead to increased electricity consumption, leads to power cuts, leads to businesses closing, and so on and so on. There's no more room for play in the system. And I'm worried that sort of cycle is only accelerating, and that resilience, and I can't talk about optimism, I can only talk about resilience at best. The way we have conceived building resilience in these societies as Western partner states has mostly been through building central states, backing strongmen, at best security sector reform to try and induce the military to have a broader social basis fundamentally and be a little bit more community policing. But fundamentally, we have never really conceived of social resilience beyond basic income payments, etc. We have never really thought about emotional resilience. And we've never really sort of integrated those into our conceptions of international and national security in the region. Or at least when we did, it was usually in the good times and never when actually things are tough. And I don't have any positive, I mean, I have minor recommendations, but nothing that would be of value discussing at this scale. I'm just saying, you know, optimism, all right. Maybe one final anecdote, because I was asked to share it. I think 2 weeks ago, I sat on an internal panel at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs next to our special envoy for Iraq and the region. And this was 48 hours before the protests started. And he said, well, you know, let's talk, I don't want to really talk about Iraq, I want to talk about Syria, because Iraq, that's our story of hope. That's the one place where everything's going the right direction. And we're talking about the startup sector, and, you know, 48 hours later, what happened? And obviously, what does the state do it starts shooting, and what does it do? It locks down the internet, and what happens when the internet's down? All the startups go bankrupt. And there's that. That's my final anecdote. Sorry to be such a bummer.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Sharif, the floor is yours. And I expect, since you're coming a week after the Tunisian elections, which more or less were deemed as partially free and fair, so I hope that at least you will have a more optimistic note on.
Well, yeah, I think my responsibility now is to be cheerful and optimistic. So I will start by saying that thank you again for the invitation. One thing for us Tunisians, one of the very few countries in this part of the world, meaning Europe, although guys, you're not yet EU, but you're Europe for us. This is one of the very few countries where we come and we don't need a visa. So coming yesterday at the airport, usually as an Arab with a Tunisian passport, I'm waiting for the white guy in the customs to ask me a lot of questions. So I give my passport and I was waiting for the questions. She looks at the passport and she gave me, that's it, and I enter Serbia. So thank you again for the invitation. This is for the cheerful part. Now going to my remarks. I'll be following my colleagues in this panel by actually saying something about how in the other side of the world we see European, this is very much a response more or less to what Hilary was saying, we see European actions in Tunisia when it comes to democracy. For some of you who are not familiar with Tunisia is the place where the Arab Spring started. Even before our Egyptian friends, we had the revolution and the collapse of dictatorship. And since then, Tunisia is seen as the only democracy in the region. And this in itself is a huge achievement. But being in Tunisia and being in regular contact with European diplomats or visitors or NGO workers, etc., it strikes me how often the discussion about democracy, even if in the beginning we start talking about democracy and democratic changes, the discussion very quickly or very often changes towards security, so fighting extremism and fighting terrorism, and migration. And again, of course, these are important topics, but if you think about security and migration, these are often very short-termist problems. They exist, so you have to deal with them now. But then, especially in the case of Tunisia again, you have a unique situation where kind of a peaceful, liberal, democratic transition is taking place in the southern Mediterranean. I believe it's a very important thing to look at. But again, the priority seems to be security and migration. And here, as a Tunisian, I feel sometimes that I'm being analyzed like a laboratory research subject. You know, I mean, being there, oh, you're a potential migrant or a potential terrorist, and this is in a way quite humiliating, but also it's also quite patronizing, and so on and so on. So this is one point about how European actions are seen in Tunisia when it comes to dealing with the situation, with the democratic situation. The other point, because of this massive interest to security and migration in Tunisia, this has created or actually pushed a lot of local organizations to form and to claim to work on these topics. And because these topics were taboo during dictatorship, earlier we were talking about other countries in the region. Actually, Tunisia before 2011 was, you could compare it to, at least in terms of freedom of expression, you could compare it to North Korea or this kind of very closed country when it comes to freedom of expression. So things about working about migration and working about security, this was impossible during dictatorship. And therefore, after 2011, you have a lot of organizations that formed and that claim to work on these topics. So very often they are made of people who have no experience or no knowledge on these topics. And the main reason why they work on these topics is to get the funds coming from the EU. And therefore, this has dilapidated a lot of money. Also, because of the lack of local expertise, we've had a lot of European and Western NGOs in general, again, working on these topics, but who have no experience or no expertise in the country, on the ground. And therefore, they come with examples that were or models that were made in Europe, but that do not necessarily fit in the Tunisian context. And that also led to a lot of dilapidation of money. And because, and here is my third point, because of, and my third and last point, don't worry, because of this focus on security and on migration, and things like counter-violent extremism and resilience and these things, in the minds of many Tunisians, the EU is actually supporting democracy only to fight extremism and to stop migration, not for the sake of democracy, which is not something that you see, for instance, in Eastern, at least not something that Eastern European countries thought of when the EU was interested in democracy in their part of the world. And also because of the security, intelligence connotation when it comes to migration and fighting extremism and fighting terrorism, this security intelligence connotation led to securization of the field of democracy and democracy engineering. And therefore, for Tunisians, there is a lot of conspiracy theories related to democratization, which is often linked to intelligence work and to security work. So sadly, I mean, we see that, and here I'm following what Mr. Sadat said, the MENA region is facing radical transformations, and the model of a strong police state or a strong strongman, that model is fading away. The emergence of democracy in a place like Tunisia can become an alternative, or may be an alternative, not necessarily now, but it's working, as we've seen in the last elections. But looking at democracy, and I'm speaking about Europeans, looking at democracy the way Arab dictatorships look at it, so looking at democracy from the lenses of security and migration, or as a security threat, that may eclipse the flame of democracy in the region and lead to losing it. So this is, again, an appeal to try to look at democracy in the region as democracy and not as a positive aspect, and not just as a negative aspect from the negative aspect of migration and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do maybe some of the panelists have some immediate reactions to what your colleagues said, or maybe we can proceed with another question? So, yes, please, Mr. Al-Sadat.
I'd like to add something very important when it comes to what we call this reconciliation. This is something we are actually badly in need in Egypt. You know, we had an experience where the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamists, they managed in 2011, 12, 13, because at that time, most of, let's say, political parties were still weak, new, so they were ready, organized, and, you know, somehow, and they managed to take over. And that was through free and fair election, when they take the majority in the parliament. I was there, and they take the majority, and it was free and fair election. And also, president in 2012, he was also elected in a free and fair election. We cannot deny this fact. Yes, they were stupid, the way they managed the country. Yes, they have no experience. Egypt was too big for them. and they didn't really manage to have this inclusiveness. Of course, I would have loved, like many others, to see them leaving in a democratic way, maybe early referendum, early election, but what happened, happened. You call it a revolution, you call it a coup, you call it a change, whatever. But this is what happened. Now, Egypt is a big country, 100 million or more, and Islamist is representing a big segment in the society. There has to be a way, a way especially for those who refrain from violence, those who respect rule of law and constitutions. We should give them a chance to be part of what is happening in the country. This is the way I see it anyway when it comes to the reconciliations. I hope that this difficult nowadays, very difficult, but I hope that one day this will happen, because no one have ever thought that Egypt at one time will make peace with Israel after all this bloodshed, after all these hate messages. But we manage to sit and to have a negotiation and to have peace. And we are both committed up till today, because we all believe that it's time that we have to live in peace. If we manage to do this with the Israelis, I don't think it's a problem to do it with our own people, wherever they are, you know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Can I just build on very quickly what you just said? First of all, I don't know if everybody is familiar with Egyptian politics, but it's a really brave thing to say in the current political context, and I think it's a really important thing to say. And I think it's something that fundamentally rings true across the region. I'll give you one example, for example, in the Syria context where I work on right now. We talk a lot about right now about refugee returns and reconstruction and all of these things, and we talk about it generally in terms of absolute numbers. We talk about how many millions return, how many houses do you need, how many housing units, how much cement do you need to build this many housing units, and so on and so on and so on. In 2016, the World Bank, for the first time, did a sort of tentative study of what it would take to reconstruct Syria. And in a first step, they did something what was eventually published as a study called Toll of War, in which they just tried to make an assessment of the damage done to Syria and Syria's economy. I was part of that, and it was absolutely eye-opening, because what they did a channels of impact analysis, in which they tried to show, okay, this is the loss of GDP cumulative over the course of the war. What share of that is due to destruction of housing, due to the destruction of economic infrastructure, due to the killing of people and disappearing of people? And what they found, and I'm not an econometrician, but it seemed pretty solid, it's the World Bank, what they found that was 92% of the cumulative GDP damage, both during the war and in the aftermath, is due to what they called economic disorganization, which is really the destruction of the social fabric of Syria. Loss of social relations, loss of trust in society, loss of contacts, important nodes, loss of human capacity, brain drain, all of these things taken together. What conflict within a society has damage that goes deeper than the absolute damage in terms of lives destroyed and infrastructure destroyed. And unless there is a path forward, what was commonly called just reconciliation, but really just a social contract on which you can start rebuilding a society, there's no path towards full development.
Thank you. So what I think we've heard is that people are disappointed, or at least, or even disillusioned, disappointed but also patient. But we also heard that this patience won't last forever, and it can reach a tipping point in future. We heard that this tipping point might come very soon with some of the challenges currently facing with the region, such as demographic challenges, the climate challenges, but also the industry, so to say, revolution in the region. But we also heard that these challenges might be new window of opportunity for more collaborative policy in the region. So I would pose perhaps two questions interconnected. First question is, how do you think these challenges will indeed impact the future of the region? And by that I mean the changing role of Islam you mentioned, but also the rise of perhaps the growth of population in the region and the rise of youth share in the entire population of the region. And also, again, the climate changes you, Mr. El Sadat, mentioned as well. And the second question related to this one would be, whose responsibility who is to face these challenges more, whether these are the political elites in the region, but also what is the share of the external actors in the region, as Mr. Sheriff mentioned, especially since we see that the role of external experts or actors actually in the region is changing. I think we're witnessing the withdrawal of the US, the changing role of the EU as well, changing role of Russia and China, but also Turkey. So I know that there is a lot of this, but we don't have much time, so please take whatever you want from this and give us your comments. Maybe we can proceed in a similar way. So.
Sure. I suppose I am tempted to put a lot of responsibility on external actors insofar as different countries have different policies, but a range of countries in Europe and North America have actively supported autocracy in the region because they perceive it as being in their interests with respect to security, or I guess more recently in Europe with migration. And for that reason, I would be inclined to say that there is a duty to attempt to help the region transition out of that. Now, exactly what form that takes is obviously debatable. I also think that given that Western countries have been made substantive contributions to economic and political, as well as climate crises, essentially the helped create these crises that then have a significant impact on the rest of the world. I would also say that there is a responsibility there. Now, exactly how to discharge that responsibility, I think that it needs to be done in a way that is different from how Mr. Sharif indicated, the frustrations he indicated. You need to communicate with the actors in the region as partners and attempt to help them meet their needs. But I think that in terms of the decision of what path to take, for instance, the decision to turn away from autocracy, the decision to take more kind of consensus building, more, trying to create a more connected society, maybe not necessarily cohesive, but connected society. I mean, those are decisions and moves that can only be made from within the region. So I think that there's a combination of both. And I would also like to say I'm very heartened to hear Mr. El Sadat say that he agrees that having more dialogue with nonviolent Islamists would be a positive thing, because I think that is a huge step in the context of Egypt. So,
thank you.
Well, if I just may add, I mean, the problem really, it's not about the Islam itself. It's about some Muslims who misinterpret Islam. I mean, after all, all the Abrahamic religions are all the same, when it comes to the values and the principles. And it's one God, as I said, for all of us. I don't see any point of having this struggle or conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. For those Muslim Shia and Muslim Sunni, there is no point. It's one religion, and it doesn't make sense. I am afraid that what we are witnessing today happening in north and east of Syria, we might see something happening in the Gulf soon. I'm a little bit worried. It will even happen by mistake, but something will happen in the Gulf. And imagine if anything happened there, they are fragile countries, honestly, they are not that strong, although they make big purchase of arms, but they are not that strong even to confront with the Iranians. So I'm honestly surprised how they think how they deal with such crisis they have there, which actually give chances for other players, as we see. The Americans, whom no one believe or trust anymore. Russians, some people in our part of the world, they starting now to believe that the Russians, you can depend on them because they stick to their friends. And this is what people have been practicing, seeing with Bashar al-Assad. The Russians, they never let him down. If you see the Americans, they don't care. They just will wash their hands any minute for any partner or any alliance. So, I mean, we are in a situation where we are honestly lost in the Middle East and the North Africa, So what I want to say is we have to somehow, the way dealing with all those radicals or those who are representing this violent extremism, our security strategy has to change. It's not only by security you can challenge these people. We need to make a different approach. And this is something I think we are lacking, although we do have an institutions which called Al-Azhar, known to be the one who promote the moderate Islam. And they have a very good religious leaders and religious preacher whom we need them to get engaged, to be connected with most of those youngsters, whether in universities or even in prison, whom they have been accused. You need to talk to these people. You need to have a dialogue with these people and to try to convince them by the religion, by the Islam itself, by most of what have been written in Islam history, So this is something we are lacking. I think we need to make more efforts to make sure that we could somehow avoid having more and more of those radicals, more, of course, beside the social and economic, of course, relief and giving them opportunities, giving them hope, because most of those who are trying to leave the country, they lost hope. They feel nothing will happen, they have no future, so they are under severe pressure. But I mean, also, when they go to this radicalizations and so on, because also the way our, let's say, securities deal with them, I think it's very tough, and it cost more pain and more revenge. And this is something we have to stop in our part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
Yeah. How to avoid these? I don't know. Looking at especially sort of the recent protesters in Iraq and also Lebanon, Syrians, a lot of people I think in the region right now, I don't even see necessarily the threat of traditional Islamist radicalization. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how is there a political path forward that can be charted in the region that's somewhat optimistic and constructive, because everybody's been discredited. I mean, if we look at Iraq, I mean, we always talk about technocratic governments and so on, but most of these parties are Islamists. And pretty hardline Islamists, frankly, of various persuasions, Shia, Sunni, whatever. And they're roughly discredited, all of them. And the same is true, I mean, Daesh is still a threat, and the jihadists are still a threat, and they still have ample recruiting grounds, but I don't think there's a large constituency across the region anymore that thinks that this is a viable project for governance in this day and age, right? So to me, a lot of these protests almost seem nihilistic at this point, as we can't even burn it down for something else anymore. We can only burn it down and hope that something arises out of the ashes. And so this seems like really dead-ended to me. Paths out of that end, I mean, the Gulf, sort of the Mohammed bin Salman UAE construct is to sort of, they think they've largely sat out the revolutions. They think they've fought back the tide of democracy in the region, and so they are trying to chart a path out of it before it can hit them, before the wave can catch up with them. And so they have a large-scale reform program social opening, economic opening tied to very strict state repression. A sort of 21st century millennial version of the old sort of IMF consensus, Mubarak consensus. Whether that can work, maybe inviting Nicki Minaj to Jeddah is a path forward. I mean, definitely Saudis are quite excited about it, right? But it is a shock still. And I think, as was outlined earlier, these are not strong states. And even reform is a shock to the system. Even reform that we think is constructive and opening, even democracy is a shock to the system. Economic liberalization is a shock to the system. Reimposition of statism, these are all dramatic changes in how these societies were balanced for decades. And, as I said, Vision 2030 is a shock, but so is cruise missiles landing on oil facilities in the Gulf. So I'm worried that the few paths forward are at extreme risk. The few sort of bubbles of, I think, open and free exchange that exist, the few news outlets, there is independent media, it's just under extraordinary pressure throughout the region, and it's running out of places where it can run and hide. Those few outlets, those few places where constructive dialogue about where we want to go as a society can happen, that those are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and those where there's still pathways within states, that those come under natural pressure because nobody in the region wants them to succeed, or nobody with power in the region wants them to succeed. I think if there is something that Westerners can do, and I know this is a cliche, and this is something that we've tried and failed at a million times in the past, is try and keep some of these spaces open as much as we can. Democratization funding is extraordinarily fraught and leads to pushback by governments. So I don't know if there's passive ways of doing that. I know German political foundations put quite a lot of effort into subsidizing, various outlets. Madame Masser, for example, has been very good at maintaining independence. Others have been forced to accept external funds to support their operations. Keeping these spaces open, keeping international spaces open for those who are willing to engage constructively on these questions, I think is extraordinarily important, not confusing states for their members. Beyond that, it's up to the people. And I'm not sure that the people, even if they do have a vision, will be heard.
Thank you. Mr. Sheriff.
On political Islam, I think political Islam, just like political Christianity, political Judaism, or nationalism in general, can be a force for good or a force for bad. And this is, I think, similar to religions. You take the holy books from Torah to Bible to Quran to Marx. And from one side, you can find that, you need to be good to your neighbor, but on the other side, you can find kill them all. So the thing with the way we look at political Islam today is a little bit like, it's this religion or this current that produces terrorism as if it was the only one that did so. No, it's not the only one. And I think we have to deal with it, but in a way different from the way that we're dealing with it today, or at least that some countries are dealing with it today. When I take the case of Tunisia, where we have political Islam, where we also had political Islam that led to terrorism, and we had also a lot of Tunisians who went to fight with ISIS. But look at today. The country is more or less peaceful. It's one of the most peaceful countries in the region. And we have elections where political Islam parties, some of them actually do not call themselves political Islam anymore, but they are. And others are actually openly Islamists, but they all together are in parliament. And with time, with relative repression, and I'm talking about the last decade, because of course those who went to extremism were repressed, but those who didn't go as far as real extremism, and so we have, for instance, parties like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an international party, whose members are very, when you listen to them, they are very radical. You think that they're gonna blow themselves up when they talk, but actually it's more blah 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 than real terrorism. And these guys, we left them in Tunisia, and they actually lost momentum because there was no big repression on them. There was no repression on them. They were allowed to say whatever they want. And now they they are just a small movement in the country, and so on. But in other countries in the Arab world, where there is still this very harsh position of fighting political Islam as if it was the only evil, and these Arab countries are actually fostering a lot of anti-political Islam movements in Europe and in the West in general, by means of, be it by means of propaganda or by means of lobbying in the US and in other places. I think in these places you find political Islam much more radical and much more resilient than it is in a place like Tunisia, which more or less encompass these groups. So this is my take on political Islam. Just quickly on your question regarding the international powers in the region. Of course, today the Middle East and North Africa are some of the most of the places where there is one of the highest concentration of foreign powers meddling in the affairs of the countries of the region, as if we were still in the 19th century. And you take Syria, for instance, there is almost a division of lands between different players, although now some players seem to be losing the battle there, but in other places as well. And here you see now more and more of Russia coming back. If you're following the region, there are every 6 months or every 3 months there is a book or a report on Russia's return in the Middle East. I wrote in one of these, by the way, and it's something that is becoming almost trendy. Russia back to the Middle East, which is true. China, probably in 5 or 10 years, you'll see the same trend about China. And this is not definitely not bringing anything good, sadly, because people from the Middle East, they thought they got over I'm generalizing, but they thought they got over the French and British imperialism. They ended up with American imperialism, and now I'm sure we will end up with Russian, Chinese, American, and whoever imperialism in the future. So I started on an optimistic note, and I'm finishing on quite a pessimistic one.
Thank you. I think it's time to pass the word to the audience, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. And then maybe we can come to your concluding remarks or some new questions of mine as well. So please introduce yourself and also tell us who are you addressing your question to. This is you guys.
Hi. It's a question for the whole panel, and you can choose 2 questions. First, I want to thank Diana for making a comment that it all sounds very similar to home. And I've been exchanging messages throughout your panel with people in the audience here of how much it resembles to the mood in the Balkans. So my question is about emotions, first one. You've talked about depression, the bad emotions, and I'm just curious, do you see possibility for these emotions to turn into violence? Because that's an impression from here, that when you don't have institutional outlet and you're desperate, the only remaining thing to respond, especially when it comes to your home, as in the case, for example, of villagers in eastern Serbia defending their rivers, they turn to violence defending their homes. So that's one question. And the second question is about the youth. I mean, this is the region with a high proportion of youth in the world. So if you could give us a bit more of their attitudes and if there are important generational differences in any of the countries or throughout the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe we can start from Mr. Cherif this time.
On youth especially, I think that will be the biggest issue that, along with a lot of other issues, sadly, but one of the main problems that the governments of the region will have to deal with is the demographic boom of the youth. One, these are youth whom they will not be able to give jobs to, and 2, these are youth who in most places in the Middle East and North Africa feel disconnected from the political system and from the states where they live. That actually partly explain their move towards violence and towards extremism, because the nation states where they live, they only see in them an oppressing power and an oppressing force. And so when ISIS came up and offered them a lot of hopes, of course, fake hopes, and many of them figured that out later. But when ISIS came and offered them this lure of being emirs or whatever, or important people, and being part of a larger nation than the nation state where they live. Many of them joined. So these youth whom the state cannot provide job to, whom the state is often repressing, and who also end up in a closed space, and that's why I started with the visa thing. Most Arabs cannot really leave their country. It's very difficult for them to go out of their country. Actually, even getting a passport in some of these countries is difficult. So they are in a state of in a status quo, but it may explode in the upcoming years. And therefore, just to finish on this youth point, it's something where actually both the local governments need to address with less repression, I think, but also something that the international community need to look at as importantly as they look at climate change and other issues, because in a few years, if there is a real youth explosion in that part of the world, then that will affect the whole world, I think, because of the big numbers of these.
Thank you. Dr. Kalbach, maybe you could proceed. I know this is something which deals with your question, with your book as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think I think the way I would put it, I would agree with you, though I would put it in a slightly different way. I'd say basically, if your needs for emotional needs, so that, you know, these upper echelons of the Maslow hierarchy, so things related to love, belonging, opportunity, you know, the chance to achieve something, almost have a direction. I think when those needs aren't met, you have a situation where you could say it's rife for negative outcomes. Whether it could be violence, it also could be polarization, it could be a lot of us versus them kind of hate stuff, instead of looking at things in terms of the common humanity and the things you have in common. Look at things as a zero-sum game where, you know, if he gets something, that means I can't have it. So it might end up in violence, but it also might end up with all sorts of other things that really sap the energy out of society and really mean that individuals within society aren't contributing to its advancement or in the ways that they could have if things were configured differently. But I would also like to say, with respect to all of these different emotions, the youth dimension has a potential to essentially exacerbate all of this, because I think that, you know, if you look at kind of different potential divisions, you've got men and women, you have foreign and local, you have different religions, you have elites, socioeconomic elite versus not elite, and I think one of the significant potential groups of have-nots are the youth. So I would say that as it fits into this picture.
Thank you. Mr. El-Sadat.
Well, I mean, I don't see any kind of violence could happen, at least when they come serious, or a revolt or a mass protest, at least for the coming 5 years. Nothing. You might have some incidents, small incidents, but real violence, no, at least for the coming 5 years. Simply, you know, yes, youth are frustrated, full of anger, but the regime is tough and very sensitive, and they know that it could end up with, let's say, with their life. Simple as that. So there is restrictions in social media, freedom of association or assembly. All the state media actually is also fueling the public opinion about any of those who speaks different than the regime, that they are with a special agenda, they are receiving foreign funding, you name it, you know. So it's a very difficult environment. So most of the youth, youngsters now, they keep themselves busy by trying to have a decent way of life, keeping themselves busy, doing anything, or even leaving the country. They are not anymore, as it happened in 2011, they were all, you know, interested in joining political parties or even civil society organization. This is not happening anymore. They are all, keeping a distance. They don't want to be part of any, because they have seen what happened to some of those activists, or whom, they were icons. They either disappear or, So it's a very difficult time for youngsters and youth, honestly, especially those who are active, Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know, in my research, especially with Syria, what you come across is an extraordinary amount of trauma. And this is obviously true. I think I was in 2011, I was also in Cairo and in Benghazi and so on. And it's true for that generation in general, that there's an unbelievable amount of trauma and a sense of loss on every sort of level. In terms of whether that lets out into violence, I mean, I'm not an expert in radicalization. My personal experience is that in 90-point-something% of the of the cases, it leads to depression and to people falling out of society and social isolation. And what was just mentioned, the sort of loss of productive capacity in society. You see people, basically just living day to day. If that, I think something we count a lot of radicalization. We count a lot of how many jihadists does a country produce. We don't really count how many suicides happen. I know from in my area where I deal, I know that suicide is rampant. It's never counted because it's embarrassing to the government. It's never really publicly acknowledged because it's embarrassing to the family. But it's a pervasive issue, I think, among young people in many of these places that we don't really acknowledge. Other associated social costs. I know I think being extremely optimistic about youth is a cliche. And maybe it's because I am still young that I don't think that we're that much better than our parents. We just haven't figured out yet how we're going to hate each other, is always my sense. And I mean, I'm very optimistic and hopeful, but realistically, I'm not sure whether by the virtue of being born later along the timeline, we have better recipes for resolving this, especially since there are many of us and the pie seems to be shrinking. And I think a lot of what was outlined earlier, the broader dimensions don't seem to be favorable to a positive outcome. I think the youth bulge, quote unquote, in the region, and I hate that expression, carries more risk than opportunity for now.
If I just may add one thing, saying what I was saying about youth, and I mean, you will see also that there is youth summits happening in Egypt and youth conferences, international, in Sharm el-Sheikh, whereby are inviting a lot of youth representation from different countries. But it's not genuine, I mean, it's all cosmetics. Yeah. It's not real selected youth whom they have something to say or whom they are really representing their, places or villages,
There's no 16-year-olds with 4 jobs at those conferences.
So this you will see. There is every maybe 6 months a conference youth, conference summit, African, international people come together, youngsters, But again, it's all pre-arranged in a way where it's just a message to the outside world. Same as, this is how most of the regimes play with the Western world. They know that the Western world, need to see some positive signs. So they play with youth conferences and youth. They play with women empowerment. This is what they do with, and gender equality and so on. And they play with religious reforms and religious speech. They know that the Western world would like very much to see, kind of coexistence between Muslims, Christians. They would like to see more of tolerance and all this. Is it genuine? This is another question. Thank you.
I would say it's probably only genuine if they've done the work to embed it in society. And I'm not the things that I'm aware of, I'm not convinced that that is the case. So I would be tempted to agree.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, please, the lady in the second row. Here's the microphone, just.
Thank you. My name is Sanja Nicolin. I come from the Women's Platform for the Development of Serbia, and I'm also amazed at how many similarities I find in your description of the MENA region and my life experience in the Western Balkans. I'm also wondering whether you have a comment regarding the recent killings of 2 women in the region. They were both prominent women's rights leaders. One was Havrin Khalaf, Kurdish leader, and the other one was Esra Abdel Fattah in Egypt. Is the situation getting worse, or are we just finding out, late what has been building up for quite a while?
Thank you.
I mean, I know Isra very well, but I mean, Isra is just detained. She's not killed. Or if something happened yesterday, I don't know. What I know, just before I come, that she is in jail, detained, like many others, following this uprising, or let's say demonstrations which took place 2-3 weeks ago. She will stay for a while. This is a normal procedure, and then they will say sorry, and they will release her. This is how it is. Not only with her, with many others. But of course, no one is happy with this. We all condemn this kind of things. We are all complaining about this. And personally, I've been communicating with her fiancé just before I come, and we have been trying to help, but very difficult. To just what you can do is to try to facilitate if she need medicine, clothes, food. That's it. But you cannot release her until they say, okay, enough. She got the lesson. Let her go. This is how it is, honestly. But I don't know about the other Kurdish girl. But I mean, whatever happening anywhere, we are all against this. This is something unacceptable, We need to see rule of law. This is what we are lacking in our societies. We need to see justice and rule of law, so everyone can feel safe and secure. It's not happening,
Mr. Schneider wanted to add something.
Two things actually. The first one on the killing in northern Syria, which was where I'm in the really awkward position of knowing both the perpetrators and the victim. And she was an extraordinary woman with an extraordinary network in a lot of enemies on all sides of this conflict. She was not, and I know this simply because I know some of the sort of rebels who were on that checkpoint in that moment where she was killed. She was not killed explicitly because she was a woman's leader. She was killed because she was driving in an armored vehicle in the middle of a war zone. They fired at the vehicle because they knew it's an armored vehicle. Somebody's important's probably going to be in there. Everybody's important on the other side is an enemy. So they shot up the vehicle, and she was pulled out. A lot of the stories that were circulated about her being stoned or raped are not true. Luckily, not that it makes much of a difference now that she's dead. She wasn't. I could go on about the role of women in northern Syria and how that has been transformed and contentious. It's an extremely complicated subject. In general, but I don't think this is a new trajectory about the challenge to women's rights in the region. I think this has been going on for decades now. I think we had a sort of long trajectory of decline in political and social rights of women. And, I mean this in a sort of more positivist sense, not so much in a regime putting on a face of having a national women's rights organization where the wife of the president is the president of their organization and they get some EU funding to host some workshops and that's it. These governments cannot really conceive, not even just of women's rights, but of rights as such. I mean, I think a good friend of mine from Saudi always makes, when they lifted the driving ban on women in Saudi. A couple of days before that, they arrested all women's rights activists in the country, basically, and a bunch of them are still in prison, including some very good friends of mine. And my friend always says, well, they made that to signal to absolutely everyone that we're going to give you this, we're going to allow you to drive, but not because it's your right. You can drive because we let you drive, not because you have some inherent right as a human being to drive. He calls it the like Pharaoh smiles upon you way of thinking of governing. You know, you can do things because we are gracious and we are grand, and not because you are a human being as such. And this is true for women's rights in the region in many respects, I think. And I'm not an expert in this, obviously, but true for general civil rights in the place.
Thank you. We had a question here, and then later.
Sorry, should I just say
yes,
something
please.
really general on that? Basically, I can't add anything to the specifics here, but I would generally say that historically, authoritarianism and patriarchy have been quite closely linked. And whether it's religious forms of kind of authoritarianism or secular, it doesn't really matter. Within the region, it's also very highly politicized and often manipulated. So, as Mr. El-Sadat said, by states. So, I'm not that hopeful. Sorry.
Thank you. Please.
A question to the gentleman from Tunisia. I happen to know that Tunisia in the recent years had big a raise in numbers and equipment and stuff for the defense sector. How did this change in the military reflect on the society? I mean, there was talk about civilian oversight and those things, but how does that work in the society itself? Okay, sorry, my name is Igor Tabak. I work as a defense analyst in these parts.
So, in the case of Tunisia, the army before 2011 was very small, but came the revolution. The army got, actually, as you were mentioning, a lot of material and got more funds, actually, not least because of the threats on the borders, especially the civil war in Libya. So what maybe that's where Tunisia was lucky, is the army was not like in other Arab states part of the political system, but it was always on its own, like a small entity, and it expanded because of the threats on the borders. But while it was expanding, there was already this democratic change happening and the democratic building of the institutions taking place. So it was not as if the army went by itself and controlled the state, but things happened on the same time together. And therefore, until now, I'm not the expert when it comes to this civilian control on the armed forces, but until now, the budget of the army is largely public. Things go through the parliament, usually in open deliberations. And we haven't seen the army involved in politics at all. Only in the last elections, actually, the anecdote when it comes to this, in the last elections, so a few weeks ago, one of the candidates was the Minister of Defense, who was Minister of Defense for several years. He's not a soldier by training, but he's quite close to the officers and everything. And there was talk in town that he was supported, that at least the officers in the army would be happy to see him the president. And in Tunisia, the elections are actually protected by the army. So the ballot boxes are transported by the army officers and army trucks, etc. But this guy came fourth in the list, not even second or third, and he lost and he's out. So this, I think, tells you almost 10 years after the revolution where the army is in Tunisian politics. I think they, at least until now, they do not represent a threat to the democratic transition, and there is a civilian control upon them.
Thank you. And then the question.
My name is Cedar Atic. I'm editor-in-chief of Public Media, specialist for security matters. The comments and question are for first three panelists, lady and two guys. How to reverse the process? You're speaking about what's happening. how to reverse that? People left countries and left to the Western world. Is it possible that they back to the native states because of why? They experience something, they have knowledge. Western countries import doctors, engineers, everything, and left not almost nothing, but you speak about youth, you speak about don't have idea what to live, how to live, not to mention about building institutions and building society and industry which will help building all those states. Is there any possibility to reverse that process, and how? And what is the power? How much power is in those countries of Western world which already imported all those people? Is there any possibility that can be kind of cooperated? I hope that everybody understands. Lady for academic level, and you two for a kind of not professional, but you are on the field. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I don't have any great magic solutions. That's outside of my aim of expertise, or area of expertise. But I can say that many of my Syrian friends who have left Syria and come to Europe, at least initially, were saying that they would love to go back and they couldn't wait to go back. And many of these people are kind of young, educated. Well, actually, we're not that young anymore, but educated individuals who could make a really substantive contribution. But I think it just depends on the circumstances, because if it just really, I think it depends on how this thing is set up. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to add something. Okay, let's see what Germany done.
Yeah.
Let's see what Europe done.
Yeah.
Exporting weapons in Jordan, in Turkey. What's happening now? How they help destroy Syria? Because I'm expert in that. I know how many things they sold to those countries around, and how that can be put into Syria. And now, is there any possibility to expect from all those countries to really help, not split? Because we already see somebody already said splitting Syria. I think it was you splitting Syria, and or whoever splitting Syria, making some borders. Splitting land, and they even is not on that soil. Okay, just to add, is there any possibility to change that? Thanks.
If I may add,
And please tell us who split the Syria.
well, no, but I mean, I think we have to do our homework. The problem, we have to do our homework. We are the one to be blamed. And all what is happening, people leaving here or trying to find an opportunity there, it's because they have a problem in their country. So again, we have to do our homework. Time that we should look into the roots of these problems and try to work it out. If we would like to be countries which could be recognized and could be real, I would say, this is how I see it. Historically, Europe is our partners. This is historically Europe. And the way I see it, I think also Europe, I remember this, there was some time where there was this neighborhood policy where Europe have to apply more for more and less for less with all those countries who are not, honestly, following or abiding by the rules, which is rules which is respected, which is all those countries, partners of Europe, has to apply by those principles and values. And the more they do, the more they could receive support, they could receive help. If they do less, then This is how the way it should be. More for more, less for less. Our future is with Europe. This is how it is, not with the Americans, not with the Russians, not with the Chinese. Even if today we see Chinese are coming and Russians are around, fine. But still, Europe is historically our partners, So we should try and see by the past experience and all those practices of Europe to try to follow. As long as they fit with our tradition, they fit with our, let's say, background. We have to do our homework.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider.
All right. I know we're not out of time. Three-part answer. First, we have done an extraordinary amount of damage in that region, and that is absolutely true. Arms exports are frankly the least of it. There's no shortage of arms in the Middle East, and most of them are Soviet and readily available. There's nothing in the region you can't get. We sometimes add a qualitative edge to certain actors. That much is true. But we've done it, and we need to do some sort of accounting. And my point would rather be that there's and the same sort of, I suppose, detached apathy that led to this damage, this sort of arrogant approach, continues as we slide into isolationism. I sat in a meeting where we were talking about Syria specifically. I sat in a meeting earlier this year with very, very high-ranking officials, basically the officials who are responsible for doing Syria policy in most Western and allied Arab states. And the Americans opened the meeting, and we had posed original starting questions in terms of look, the situation in Northeast Syria is unsustainable and so on. This whole strategy does not seem to address any of the causes of this. And the Americans opened the statement with saying, look, the United States is no longer interested in what they called root causes lines of argument. They no longer care to try and understand it, no longer care to try and fix it. They're 7,000 miles away, as Donald Trump says. And basically the fundamental point is that if it goes too far off the rails, if swaths of territory fall under the control of people with very long beards, they will flatten the cities and then leave again. And that's just going to be a repeat cycle. Europeans, as I said, are much closer tied and should have a bigger stake in it, but lack really the capacities to do it to some degree. Very frankly, what we can do is sanctions humanitarian aid and sell weapons to who we think is the good guy in the moment, but that tends to reverse quite regularly. So there's the first part of that. In terms of refugees and returns, the first thing is to say that almost none, an absolutely minuscule share of refugees from Syria specifically fled from European or Western weapons. And this is where agency has to go a little bit back to the region. A good chunk of the disaster and of the violence is the fault of local actors and local governments and local militaries. And again, they don't lack in high explosive material to enforce that sort of thing. We flattened some cities that were held by the Islamic State, but most cities that are destroyed in Syria were destroyed by the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And that was a war fought against his own people. And this was where almost all of the displacement, or at least external displacement, happened, because by the time the Islamic State came around, we had actually locked down most of the borders. Because this is what we're also very good at as Europeans. We don't just export weapons, we also export fences. And so the European Union actually financed an extraordinary border security system along the southern Turkish border that now is used to lock about 3 million IDPs. 3 million people, 1.7 million IDPs, but they're all going to be displaced soon enough. Under constant bombardment on the other side of the border. So no, we're not responsible. In terms of returns, you've heard us outline a not exactly optimistic vision of the region, of these governments. Very honestly, if you made it to Europe and you long for your hometown and so on, but your children can go to a European school and university and build a life there, and they will, after a few years, they will speak better German and Swedish and French than Arabic, frankly. Are you going to send them back? There are the universities in Syria no longer have professors with university education. Everybody who could get out is out. And so actually, if you sit in track twos with the Syrian government, they will ask. They will go like, look, can you send us back the guys you trained? We need people in water management. We need these and these and these people. And these people will never voluntarily go back, because this is the third part of my answer. What I do as a form of volunteering is I write sort of amicus briefs for court proceedings because people on temporary protected status, people who are trying to defend their asylum status. And so what we do is we write up the story of how they are threatened, and the threat is not gone. The threat, as we conceive it, maybe might be deteriorated of the Islamists, but all the other threats, and the biggest threat to the average Syrian is the Syrian government, is there. And so these people are not going to back, neither because they don't want to, because children, school, education, but also because they're most likely going to be imprisoned, because their governments don't really want them back. They want back engineers, but they don't want the person who is the engineer, because the person who is the engineer spent too much time in Germany learning about democracy and such, and maybe has friends and relatives who did questionable activism. There's no path forward. So my humble conclusion is that most of these people will not go back. Some who will be politically palatable to the regime will go back for the summer to visit their grandparents' villages. Like in Lebanon, there's a large diaspora that returns for the summer. In many Middle Eastern countries there is, and that leaves back again, and that'll feel semi-Syrian and semi-Lebanese and semi-Iraqi. But there's not going to be a wholesale return.
Just a quick comment from
Yes,
Mr. Al-Sadat.
Speaking about those who leaves, in 2017, I proposed in a conference in Cairo with the Arab League, League of Arab States, a proposal by saying, well, all those Gulf countries, rich, big lands, they have the money, they should open their borders to all those refugees, Syria, Iraq, and so on. And instead of having people from Philippines, from India, I said, well, these are people who speak the language, they can easily be integrated within the society. So, but it was rejected, I tried to, to say, well, it's you should be responsible and, more or less same religion, same language, and you have, and you need, actually, they need people. They are bringing them from Filipino, from India, but then they rejected. They say, no, we will not accept. But anyway, sorry.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we'll have to end here. I'm really sorry for not taking all the questions, but we are really run out of the time. So thank you all for speaking. I perhaps have two concluding comments. One is that the title of the panel was indeed right, and it's quite difficult to end on a positive note, and we're really talking about the winter and discontent. The second one was already made, and that is that many of the points you raised are actually screaming with the Western Balkans appearance. And one of actually the quotes which intentionally or unintentionally Mr. Schneider made was actually the Churchill's comment on the Balkans, and this is the region as well which produces more history than it can absorb. And the one thing which came to my mind, that one of the most prominent explanations of the term of the Middle East is actually that the middle label came from the fact that the Balkans was already the Near East for the British in the office. Meaning that, well, these things, while much has changed, something still hasn't. And these two regions are still the neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods of the EU or the entire Euro-Atlantic community. But what has indeed changed is that the discontent from the panel also moved to the streets of some of the oldest and most developed democracies. And while this sparks anxiety and fear, it also opens the opportunity for rewriting the social contracts we talked about, for making them more adaptive, more inclusive, more for human-centric, more connected, and also more effective. So thank you all for coming today, and we really enjoyed I really enjoyed at least your comments and discussions.